Oh, hello, and hopefully welcome back, everyone. But for those who couldn't make it to the earlier panels, my name's Christian Reilly. I'm the co-host of the MMT podcast. And on behalf of the organizers of the Second International European MMT Conference, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, our audience from around the world. And once again, it's my great pleasure to moderate this final panel for today on the political economy of fiscal policy. And again, to maximize time for the discussion, I'll briefly introduce our panelists. On this panel, we have MMT founder and author of the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, Warren Mosler. We have Professor Achim Truger, who is currently serving as a member of the German Council of Economic Experts. We have Philippa Sigl-Glöckner, who is the director of the economics think tank, and forgive my pronunciation here, Dezernat, Zukunft, and in English, I believe that's the Department of the Future, which sounds great. And we have Professor Paul Sheard, who is currently research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School after a career of holding chief economist positions at Lehman Brothers, Standard & Poor's Rating Services, and S&P Global. So given that we have such a distinguished panel, let's get straight into the topics for discussion. And I thought I'd throw this question to Warren to start with, and then come to each panelist in turn for their thoughts and any other opening remarks. So turning to you, Warren, why would a national government want to deliberately create unemployment? For any people who weren't here for your interview yesterday, a little recap.
Okay, so there's 2 levels to that question. One level, on the fundamental level, if the government wants to be able to provision itself to hire a military, legal system, public health workers by using its currency, it has to have people who are willing to work for that currency, people who are looking for jobs paid in that currency, and people looking for work in that currency. That's how we define unemployment: people looking for paid work, not people looking to volunteer for the American Heart Association or something like that. And so to create unemployment, governments impose tax liabilities. This creates, and I always use a tax on everybody's house as an example, so we don't have to start thinking of complex interactions due to transactions taxes like income tax and that kind of thing. So you put a tax on everybody's house in something they don't have, the national currency, and now you've got a drain in the bathtub, and they need to get the water to be able to live. And so they're out looking for paid work that pays in that currency, and now the government can hire them with its otherwise worthless currency. So that answers your question on one level. And on a second level, and this is always been troublesome for me, but it's something we have to deal with. People like unemployment just as a population, because let's say you have 10% unemployment, 90% of people have jobs. A lot of them are fixed income. And, there's the last thing they want is inflation, of course, not that they can't keep up, but they don't want to have to deal with that. And they like the idea that if the pipe breaks and they need a plumber, there's 3 or 4 plumbers who are out of work, competing to fix their pipes. Or if they need home improvements and they need a carpenter, there are people out of work looking for work. That they like that situation. And when you get a situation closer to full employment, and it's hard to find people to come out because they already work, they have work and jobs, and you have to pay more, to compete with what they're doing, people don't like that. And so you almost have to appeal to the humanitarian side of people and to the, some form of empathy to get support for real full employment problems when you for real full employment policy, not problems, policy at that level. So let me leave it at that.
Okay, thanks for that, Warren. That's characteristically crisp. So unemployment is a policy tool, or a result of using this policy tool that we colloquially call money, and it allows the government to spend. And then your second point being unemployment's great, except for the people who are unemployed.
Yes.
So I'm going to turn to you now, Philippa. Do you have any comments on this opening question about governments deliberately creating and then ameliorating unemployment, but not quite enough?
Yeah, and I guess, forgive me, I see it probably from the stupid government's employee perspective. So I'm a former Ministry of Finance official, and rather than looking at kind of the end state or the abstract, I guess I've seen the difficulties in practice, which probably can be overcome if you're more creative. So two things to that. First of all, yes, I mean, I agree that at the moment we use unemployment as a macro tool, although probably not even very coherently, because we've got this whole theory of the Nairo, and that we need a certain level of unemployment to keep inflation at bay, which doesn't really seem to hold. And then I don't know that much about it in the US, but I know that in Europe we play lots of funky games with the Nairo, essentially, to somehow get results for our fiscal rules that the politics around it doesn't explode. On that framework, yeah, I think it's very hard to defend, and one shouldn't defend it, and one should look for a better one. And there's obviously no reason to turn down deficit because we're close to the Nairo. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Spain's supposed to have a Nairo above 10%. I do think it's a little bit trickier on a micro level. It's not just governments creating unemployment. I mean, now looking at the specific German situation, for instance, but I guess you have the same in many other industrial economies that are changing. You do just have unemployment because of skills mismatches, because lots of factors which are quite tricky, and it's not that easy to overcome at the micro level. And I'm not sure that just at the macro level, providing enough demand will fix it all. Maybe I'm not creative enough. So I completely on board on the macro side. I think then on the micro side, we also need to do some active interventions to kind of help push from that side as well.
Thank you, Philippa. And moving on to Achim, do you agree with this broad view of this broad macro view that MMT puts forward, the charterless view? Anything to add?
Well, I'm not so sure whether I really share or buy everything. It's of course, if it's very broad, then I would agree that the government can do a lot to reduce unemployment, to have very low unemployment, and there may then be political reasons why the government does not use its power. That's, I think, quite uncontroversial. But as Philippa already hinted at some factors, there may, of course, be some economic reasons why maybe the government could not be able to have unemployment without serious side effects. And the one obvious, which I know is contentious, but may, of course, be inflation. Philippa had some other factors. But then that's the economic analysis. I think then also from a political economy point of view, I'm not so sure whether it's that easy that there is the government and there are the people, and the government does what the people, or maybe the 90% people who are employed, what they want. I mean, there can be lots of controversy. There can even be class struggle. Many things can happen. And of course, it's possible that the government, for political reasons, serving some interests, maybe also partisan interests, could then prevent the government, the unemployment rate from being as low as possible. But that's a complex issue, and I think we should. Yes, and if we go to the European level or the EU level, Euro area currency union, then it's very, very complex. But that's something that we can address in the next round, I think. Thanks.
Great. Okay. And finally, turning to you, Paul, do you have any overarching comments to make about political economy and of fiscal policy?
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, It's an interesting question, and I'm tempted to say I don't think that governments deliberately are that sinister to want to create unemployment. Although I do take Warren's point that those in employment can often be blasé about the suffering that is happening to the unemployed. I tend to approach this political economy issue and perhaps nest this question inside a slightly different take on the question, which is, does the current conventional framework that we have in the world, does that do a good job of attaining full employment and good macroeconomic outcomes? And what is that framework? Of course, that framework, taking a little bit of liberty, is rests on a couple of pillars. One is a fairly strict, not totally strict, but a fairly strict separation of monetary policy from fiscal policy, and also a different conceptualization and operationalization of those two macroeconomic policy tools. And secondly, the idea that we can assign society, can and should assign the primary role of achieving full employment, price stability, financial stability now as well, to the central banks and to monetary policy, with fiscal policy taking more of a backseat role and maybe just a supplementary or a kind of an emergency fire engine that turns up in a crisis. And I think that framework, what we've learned over the last 20 years, and I think MMT has come at this whole issue from a more sort of analytical first principles perspective. But what we've also learned just from watching Japan and then watching the global financial crisis and now with COVID and what's happened to economies and what policy levers have been pulled, what we've learned is that is a flawed framework. It's a framework which works well in some circumstances. And in fact, it's evolved to work well in a certain set of circumstances. What other circumstances? When the proximate threat is runaway inflation or high inflation. And, I hardly need to dwell on that for any German audience that's listening in. But that framework, so basically, and the irony here is that, there's this sort of kind of pitch warfare almost, or acrimony that goes on between the MMT and the mainstream. But the sort of irony is that the reason we have this strict separation of monetary and fiscal policy, which is most strictly codified in the Eurozone kind of architecture, is precisely because we sort of learnt the lesson in the 20th century that governments can create fiat currencies, can spend, can print money, and if that is not checked in some way, it will lead to a high inflation. So we devised this kind of neat way of dealing with that problem. But that does not deal, in fact, is, I would say, almost counterproductive in many ways when there's an opposite problem, which is if there's a huge shortfall of aggregate demand, much too high unemployment, if there's a financial crisis and a potential meltdown, if there's a very low natural rate of interest, or R star that the central banks talk about, or if there is a deflationary environment, such as in Japan, then this strict separation of monetary and fiscal policy and assigning the primary role to monetary policy, I think does not work very well. And then we run into all the political economy issues around, what are the fiscal policy makers supposed to do, and how do they do it, and how do they coordinate, if they do coordinate, with monetary policy. So that's sort of my lens on this broad question.
Okay, thank you for that. And Warren, Paul brought up there this sort of separation of church and state. There's fiscal policy, monetary policy. I mean, it's been my understanding for a while, though, that central banks and Treasury coordinate all the time. That the separation isn't quite as hard as they'd like us to think it is. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I suppose they do, but they don't need to. There's no reason to that.
Okay.
The Treasury can run any size deficit it wants, regardless of what the central bank is doing. Mm-hmm. What I pointed out for a long time, starting in the 1990s, is that I think that they've got the interest rate thing backwards, and that raising rates is actually inflationary and cutting rates is deflationary, contractionary. Negative rates is a tax, so it's even more deflationary. It's a spectrum. Negative rates are a tax, positive rates are a subsidy. And when I look at the world that way, through that lens, so to speak, it all makes perfect sense. And all the data seems to fit what I'm doing. And I see a lot of research papers around the edges that confirm it. And I've been watching this for 30 years, and I'm not trying to prove I'm right. I don't, when I'm out living in the world, I want to understand why it works and be able to forecast and that type of thing. And let me just say something quickly about, we've got Nehru in mainstream economics, but we also have game theory. And game theory tells you that the labor market, if you want to call it that, isn't a fair game. People have to work to eat, and business only has to hire if they like their return on equity prospects. And so that alone, what you learn in the first week of game theory, will tell you that you would expect real wages to stagnate due to the fact that you've got this unfair game. And that's exactly what we observed. And so without some kind of support for labor, we get stagnating wages. And so, if you look at even if unemployment's down to the last guy, what's his leverage? He either takes the job offered or he doesn't eat that week. So it just, the micro foundations just aren't there to support the Nehru and that's just mainstream economics. And so that's, all the research around whether the Nehru is real or not real or whatever has always been problematic for the central banks and for the mainstream. And they talk about why it shifts all the time. It goes up and down. And it's because what they call inflationary pressures are happening for other reasons. Did I answer your question?
I think you said some great stuff.
Okay.
I'll carry. So I wanted to get the European. Excuse me. I was going to throw this one to Philippa because I'm a little bit of an outsider on what it must be like to be in the Eurozone, but it seems to me in this current pandemic crisis is different to the global financial crisis in terms of cause, but also in the broad strokes, I think it's a different world now in terms of policy response, in terms of governments understanding what they can and can't do. So I'm going to come to each of you in turn, but I'll start with you, Philippa. How do you think ideas about fiscal policy in a crisis have changed since the global financial crisis and this crisis?
I actually think, for crisis, it's been accepted for a while that, you're allowed to do active fiscal policy. But we did it to quite a large extent now. And Isabel Schnabel from the European Central Bank gave a speech yesterday where she said, well, this is the first time where fiscal policy has actually been supportive of what we're trying to do now during the crisis. So yeah, we had quite a big response, which I think was made possible, first of all, by basically suspending the European fiscal rules. Or allowing countries to just go into deficit without a certain set limit. And secondly, because we had built out a little bit the entire, if you want to call it, I hate the word safety net structure. You have sovereign bonds which should be safe by definition, and we create a euro area and make them unsafe, and then we build out a safety net to kind of make them safe again. But you have the European Stability Mechanism. You have the ECB, which can jump in. So I think basically, there wasn't a question about whether countries were able to refinance themselves. And then obviously the ECB came forward with, huge government bond buying. So basically just bought a lot of the debt that got issued. So arguably in this crisis, I think fiscal monetary coordination worked fairly well, whether that was implicit or explicit. Okay.
And Achim, I was going to turn to you. Do you think that the structure of the ECB has learned lessons from the global great financial crisis? Is their approach to this crisis a little better?
Yes, of course, it's much better because now the system is stabilized. We don't have a crisis for government bonds. We don't see this, and that's of course because the ECB has learned the lesson. Since Draghi or when Draghi came into office, everything changed. So I think concerning the ECB, I wouldn't be critical. The critical thing is fiscal policy and the attitudes and views about fiscal policy. There has been a significant change there as well, because when the euro crisis hit, then basically the idea dominated that fiscal policy was ineffective, multipliers very low, and that you could and also have to consolidate fast the budgets, and that this will not have a high cost in terms of employment and output. And I think this has been completely rejected by the evidence. We have new estimates for the multiplier. We know it's an effective tool. And by now, many people in the European Commission, in many governments, many researchers, they recognize that you cannot consolidate in times of crisis, and that you have to stabilize the system, and that you need expansionary fiscal policy, and that you cannot withdraw the stimulus soon. So that's for sure. There is even consensus on the European level that there is consensus among many people on the European level that we need a change in the fiscal rules, because sticking to those rules would drive the euro area and the periphery into crisis again. And this will be the last crisis of the euro system, of course. So this, I think, is by now recognized by many people, but it's not yet common sense, and we will see a major struggle over the coming months and years about the reform of the rules, and this will be tough, because there are really many people, conservative people mostly in the northern countries or middle European countries, that really think that you need sound fiscal policy, meaning you have to actively cut the government debt now. And if you still see budget deficits, then it's a problem of the governments not being willing to cut spending. So, but actually, I think that's very wrong. But that's the debate that we are going to have in Europe over the next. Well, as soon as the German election is over, I think we see the debate.
And so that debate should be informed by asking the right questions. So I was just going to turn to Philippa. I know that Paul has some strong feelings about the structure of the EU as it relates to fiscal and monetary policy and sovereignty and those matters. But Philippa, you recently wrote a paper entitled "A New Fiscal Policy for Germany." And you begin by asking, what is the right objective for fiscal policy? What might an institutional framework look like to put this objective into practice? And what concrete, politically realistic reform options could move us in that direction? Would you mind laying that out for us? And for those of us who are new to German fiscal policy, can you say what the debt brake is, just in case we leave anybody behind?
Sure. So let me start with maybe the fiscal framework in Germany and Europe, because it really kind of relates to both. So in Germany, we have a so-called to the debt. It limits the annual budget deficit, first of all, to 0.35% of GDP plus a cyclical adjustment, which is where basically the whole question of output gap comes in, and depending on how far away you are from your alleged potential, depending on that, you're allowed to do more or less deficit spending. This is also where the German debt brake is basically tied straight into the European rules. The European rules in total are pretty complex, but basically they limit you to 60% debt to GDP, a 3% deficit, and then you have, and this is like when you're already kind of in a bad corner, and then there's so-called preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact, which you should stick to if you want to be in a good corner, and that says you should limit your medium-term deficit to 0.5%, cyclically adjusted. So, depending on your output gap, you're allowed to do more or less. So we kind of, I guess, tackle it from two sides. We tackle it from trying to understand what actually the right objective is, and then, what can you actually make work in our context? Because it's always going to be an evolutionary process, and then also we think it's urgent we do something. I share Achim's worry that, now after the crisis, we will get back to, oh my God, we need to reduce debt, and that would really be quite destructive. So on the high level objective, we do see full employment as quite a good objective, especially when you look at what the big problem in aging societies is, which is, basically having enough money to pay pensions. Probably good idea if people at working age work, even if you're just like cold-hearted budget person, because then they pay tax, and you don't have to pay social security to sustain them. When we started, we talked about full employment and realized that people in the German European context didn't really understand that well, because they say, well, everybody in Germany has a job. Problem is, indeed, most people have a job, but a lot of them are very poor jobs. So, they just don't pay for a living. It's 10% of our workforce is marginally employed. So that really doesn't do very much for your living, not even speaking of your pension. So we speak of full capacity utilization. And then we say, all right, let's start with the current framework, and how can we, take a first step in the right direction? Because I don't know what the perfect optimal state is, but the more relevant one, I think, is how can we make reform progress in the right direction? And so what we say is, how about, we take that definition of what full capacity under the debt brake is, because that defines how much deficit you're allowed to run every year, and try and really think about, or get closer to what full capacity is than what it is today. Today, we define full capacity as, the output of the economy yesterday. So if only 50% of women in Germany were working, well, then we say full capacity is, if half of women do not work. That seems pretty ridiculous to, I think, any sane human being, whether you're an economist or not. The advantage, if you move from a definition of full capacity from what it was in the past to, what could it reasonably be, is that you can do that without changing the German constitution. I mean, some legal scholars have now looked at this as well, and it's looking like we can probably even do it if everything goes well without changing or a major legal change, because it's really quite in the technical details of things. We're not changing the basic setup. And then you could essentially do the same thing for Europe. You have a working group that looks at the technical ins and outs of this, and change the definition of capacity. And you still have rules, and it's still somehow arbitrary how you then multiply this output gap with whatever number, semi-elasticity. But I think it will already bring some form of reality back to the rules, and you would get a step closer to looking at what can our economy actually do, and hopefully even make it fiscally more sustainable, if you want to talk about it in those terms.
Okay, that's great. So I'm going to turn to you now, Paul. And so you Philippa's talking about trying to ask the right questions and chart the best way forward. And she mentioned, that the Eurozone and the EU it's still evolving, it's still in flux, and this is something that you bring up in your 2018 article entitled "Brexit is a wake-up call to the EU," but so far it's not being answered. And So back then you wrote, it's not too late for Brexit to be seized as an opportunity on both sides of the English Channel to reconfigure the sharing of national sovereignty in a more politically and economically sustainable way. So could you say more about that and anything else from that article that you think has bearing on what we're talking about here?
Thanks very much, Christian. That's a travel back in time. Yeah, I was quite. I'm an Australian American sitting here on the east coast of the US. I've never lived in Europe. I've never lived in London. Although sometimes people take my accent to indicate that I'm a Brit. No, not so. So I'm, with a little bit of reluctance, way into this. But as an economist, I look at these things. And I was pretty active in the Brexit debate. And one of the key points I was making is 99% of the focus around Brexit was about obviously the UK exiting. What I was trying to point out is that Britain was not leaving a fixed point. It was leaving a political and economic entity, which was very much, I would say, dysfunctionally designed, and because of that, very much in flux. So I put more emphasis on that point. Now, what do I mean by that? And again, we're going from one extreme to the other here, because Philippa and Achim obviously are in the weeds, in Germany, and of course dealing with practical issues. And I'm flying at 60,000 feet here and talking in kind of abstract terms about sovereignty and monetary unions and things like that. So there's a bit of a, we're moving from a different cross dimensions of space here. But when I look, and I'm not alone in this, I think probably most mainstream economists outside the Euro area or the European Union, and I can't speak for MMT people, but I suspect most MMT people would also look at the Eurozone, in particular the Euro area, in kind of horror, because it is, from an economic point of view, a very dysfunctionally designed thing. Why is that? It's a monetary union. So what does that mean? It means that the 19 member states of the Euro area have given up their monetary sovereignty. I mean, that's a key concept in MMT, but it's important even from a mainstream perspective. But they didn't give up their fiscal sovereignty. So again, if it's an MMT insight, I think really revolves around, monetary and fiscal are almost two sides of the same coin, two ways of looking at the elephant, but they're really, it's all about money creation and how that happens. So to split that Humpty Dumpty in two, and on the monetary, sort of narrow monetary front, the currency front, say we are going to behave as if we are one sovereign entity. We're going to pool our monetary sovereignty. But then on the fiscal front, to say, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to remain 19 fiscally sort of separate nation states. That is really, really dysfunctional. Now, of course, it's not that simple, because it's even worse than that, because as you know, of course, as we've talked about and everybody knows, because they designed a monetary union but not a fiscal union, they said, well, we're going to have to put fiscal constraints and fiscal restraints, the Stability Growth Pact, fiscal compact, and all of these things, and even embedded in German's constitution, so that we don't get this fiscal free riding at the nation state level on the monetary sovereignty. But what that does, and again, I think that the design of the Euro area institutionally sort of came as the apotheosis, if I can pronounce that word, the kind of apex of the thinking around monetary policy being the be all and end all, and basically relegating fiscal policy to the back seat and worrying about fiscal sustainability, etc. So all of that was kind of codified in the Eurozone, but it's created a very dysfunctional entity in the following sense. Take an Italy or a Greece or a Spain. You're looking at a country now that doesn't have their own monetary sovereignty anymore, doesn't have their own independent monetary policy. And of course, that's just a simple application of the Mandel's trilemma, that you've got essentially a fixed exchange rate with everybody else in the Euro area, free capital movement. So you've lost your monetary sovereignty, but you've also lost your fiscal flexibility and your fiscal space artificially, because now you don't have that central bank that can sort of bail you out, and you don't have the unlimited ability to kind of spend, because markets may not actually look kindly on that. That was sort of the sovereign debt crisis of 2012 to 2015. So you don't have the margins of adjustment. Now, is this a big deal? Well, it's not necessarily a big deal for Germany, but it is a big deal. I mentioned Italy and Greece and Spain. The level of, we've had 3 shocks now in the euro area. We had the global financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and now COVID. And I just like to look at some simple metrics just to figure out how is this looking. If you look at where the real GDP is now in Italy, for example, relative to where it was at the peak before the financial crisis, the accumulation of these 3 shocks, it's almost 9% below. The US, same metric, is 22% above. Greece is nearly 28% below level of GDP. Now, Germany is much better. It's 10% above its pre-crisis level. Its unemployment rate is quite low. Italy and Greece, unemployment rate now is considerably above the pre-global financial crisis level. So that's in a nutshell kind of the problem here, that the 19 and the 27, if you go to the EU countries, are in this political treaty-based construct that is just very, very badly designed. You mentioned sovereignty. Just from a pure kind of analytical point of view or conceptual level, the big problem I see with the euro area or the EU is that you have a partial and inconsistent pooling or sharing of sovereignty. So on some dimensions, monetary policy, freedom of movement of people, foreign trade. On some dimensions, the EU or the euro area was switched between the two, functions as if it's one big, United States of Europe. Whereas on other margins, particularly fiscal policy, but even, protection of the national border, or even the external border, the EU plays quite a small role in the protection of the external EU border, strangely enough. You have these 27 countries or 19 countries, depending on what we're looking at, behaving as separate nation states. That does not make any sense. So how do you solve this problem? I believe in a nutshell, and I think you're going to ask about this later on maybe, what's the future? Either they have to move in Europe to a more consistent and functional sharing of sovereignty. That means going towards a fiscal union, going towards political union as well, in a much truer sense. Or I think they have to start to repatriate the sovereignty that they pulled in the past back to the nation state level. And the problem is they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. It's easy for me to state these choices. If you're living in the system and trying to coordinate political change in either direction, it's very, very difficult. But what we can say is if you look at the history of the last 10 to now even 12, 15 years, as shocks have been applied to the EU and the euro area, with the exception of Brexit, everything has moved in one direction, which is more collective action, if you like, more pooling of sovereignty, more movement towards the United States of Europe, if you want to call it that, perhaps in a looser form than you have in the US. Whether that's going to remain the direction of travel or not, who knows? But what I do feel with strong degree of conviction is the current situation cannot be the steady state solution that we're going to see in the EU.
Thank you for that. And I'll come to Achim in a minute, but I thought I'd just, for the insider's view, but I thought I'd just complete the deeply interested outsider's view by asking Warren about this. So I think we would all agree that the current Eurozone deficit rules are hampering aggregate demand and therefore creating unemployment. So if we agree to that, what fiscal policy rules are needed instead, Warren?
Well, they are moving in that direction. And I outlined all of this back in the early 1990s before they had locked the currencies, when it was still under discussion. It led to our presenting what we thought was going on in Europe. In 1996, we had a Bretton Woods conference, and you can see the writings. It's all turned out to be the case of what was happening, and which Paul described a lot of that very well. So I think the easiest thing in a short presentation here is just to say what it is going to look like at the end. Where is it heading towards? And it's heading towards the ECB just having a permanent zero rate policy. Once they understand, of course, that raising rates is inflationary, there's no reason left to raise rates. You just leave them at zero. And and then the Maastricht limit becomes a policy tool rather than rather than a limit. And so you might look at it this year and say instead of 3% this year, it needs to be 8 or 12 or whatever. And you'll have some hopefully democratically responsible authority coming, using that as a policy tool, whether it's the European Parliament or the European Commission or something. Right now, it's the European Central Bank that's setting fiscal policy, because if they don't approve of what any country is doing with their fiscal policy, they threaten to pull them out for the do what it takes to prevent default umbrella. The spreads start widening, and there's a panic for them to get back under that umbrella, and they come quickly in line. So the only entity, and it's by default, the ECB, I'm not sure the ECB wanted to be in that position, but there was no other entity left to enforce fiscal rules. The treaty process for enforcing fiscal rules didn't work. So we've got really the only central bank in the world right now that's dictating fiscal policy. So to get back to where you get to, so you get to the Maastricht limit becoming, you keep the guarantee in place, and it should be made explicit, and it probably will be, that the central bank will not allow a default, that all the bonds from all these nations are money good. And then with a permanent zero rate, debt service is zero for everyone for all practical purposes. And so it doesn't matter whether your deficit's 125% from past behavior or 60%, everybody's got the same debt service forever, which is zero. So it gives you a clean sheet of paper start to, on the issue to do this. And then when you've got the European Parliament or Commission or somebody using the Maastricht limit, what's today the Maastricht limit, the fiscal limit, as a policy tool, and then they'll be having the debate in what I'd call a rational context. Do we need more restrictive or more expansive fiscal policy? They'll vote on it, and then each country will then be allowed to go to that new policy limit. And I'd go a step further and have the countries balance their budgets, and then have the ECB just make a fiscal distribution to all the member nations maybe on a per capita basis, on whatever percent of GDP they determine is appropriate for the union. So does that answer your question there?
Absolutely, yeah. So
okay.
I'll turn it over to you, Achim. What we just heard sounds like common sense to me, or it sounds very reasonable. What do you make of it as somebody within the Eurozone?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I completely agree with Paul's analysis that the institutional arrangements, this can never be a steady state, of course. And then, of course, we need something like a fiscal capacity and euro bonds that are backed by the central bank. I think that's something that we really need. I'm not so sure about the institutional details that, or the concept that Warren has just presented, because I don't think, we are not going to get a clean sheet approach. We do have to go there in small steps. We need a stepwise approach, and every little step is politically contested. And there is always the risk of failure. But of course, if I want to be optimistic, then I will just mention that nobody will ever have believed that we would see such a rescue and resilience facility on the European level, that the countries would finally agree to have that. And there were people that I know well that just months before said, we have the ESM, let's the Italians and everybody who's in trouble, they can just turn to the ESM, then they get some some loans, they will have to repay them, and there will be strict conditionality. So that was the approach at the time that some people, some ordoliberal scholars had in mind, and I'm sure also some conservative politicians had in mind. But that's not how it developed. And I think what helped very much was the experience that we had the supply chains that were completely in disorder after the COVID-19 shock, and that everybody was well aware how very, very important international coordination is, and that we really have to rely on each other, that we depend on each other. I think that was a lesson learned, and that in the end made this fund possible. And well, if you want to be optimistic, Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister, spoke of a Hamilton moment. At the time, this was the agreement was reached, and why couldn't we stepwisely move forward and develop this? And I don't believe that we will ever have a clean sheet approach unless we have a huge crisis and the whole thing goes to pieces. Then, of course, we need a clean sheet approach. But at the moment, we have to go stepwisely. It's politically contested. It's difficult. But in the end, I think people will have to understand that this idea, national governments are responsible for their budgets, and the financial markets are watching and controlling national budgets, and you just have to obey the market practice, and then everything, and you have to do your homework, and then everything is fine. This is a concept that doesn't work if you don't have a sovereign currency, or if you don't have if you're not in control of the currency. That's, I think, it's as easy as that. But it's a huge step to make people aware of this, I can tell you.
Okay, and just yes, please, Warren.
Just quickly, let me suggest that we're already there. We already have a zero rate policy. It's just a question of leaving it alone, which has always been easy. Just leave things alone. Debt service is already approaching zero due to the zero rate policy. Just leave it alone. And the Maastricht limit has become a policy tool, as evidenced last year that Italy was 11% debt to GDP. The deficit as a percent of GDP was like 11% or something like that. So it's already being used as a policy tool. So it's functionally already there. It's just a question of formalizing this or not formalizing it and just leaving it alone. So I'm hopeful in that sense. And as you said, it took a great crisis to get there. And so we've already had the great crisis. Couldn't have been any more severe than a health crisis. And all these things that I'm talking about are functionally there right now. So, I'm hopeful it can stay there. The one thing I'd like to see would be the what has been called the job guarantee, which is a transition job to promote the transition from unemployment to private sector employment once the public sector is fully provisioned. And I actually did that in a paper, academic paper that was published along with my co-author was Professor Philippa from Calabria. And it's in the Journal of Policy Models, is it called? Policy Modeling. So it's published in a leading mainstream journal. So along with the rest of these things I just talked about. So it's there. I think I'm more hopeful than everyone else that we've kind of backed into the right answer through a series of crises and through millions of destroyed lives. But, we are there, and I'm somewhat optimistic of the future of Europe right now.
Okay. And Philippa, Warren just brought up the Eurozone-wide job guarantee. It's sometimes called an MMT. Warren likes to call it a transition job. Are you aware of that? Because I remember that paper, Warren, that you framed it as a stabilization tool. Obviously it has social benefits, but you framed it as a stabilization, macroeconomic stabilization tool. I don't know, Philippa, are you familiar with this? And what are your thoughts on that?
Let me just make one more comment on the question earlier. I would love to be that optimistic. I don't think we are nearly there. Last year, we were allowed to run whatever deficit because we suspended the rules. We completely suspended them, and actually the clause for when you can do that, they're not that flexible. I mean, people are trying to stretch them now, and we are already stretching them so that we can suspend them for 2022 as well. But that's going to be tricky, and I think everybody is fighting as much as they can so that 2023 we won't get a contraction like we did after the financial crisis. I think this is a serious risk, and so I'm a bit more sanguine on that, because changing European primary legislation is incredibly hard when you have quite a few countries opposed to this. We just had a letter published by countries like the Netherlands, the Austrians, who said, you know what, we're not changing this. The 60% debt to GDP level, it seems completely mad, but it is still a number that people believe in. And they still think we need to get back to 60%. It's not even really 90%. Not even speaking of moving away from that completely arbitrary, useless number. It's 60% is where we're safe. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, unfortunately, and we need to do it really, really fast, because you can't really do fiscal policy a month at a time. Portuguese, Greek, Italian government kind of needs to know what they're able to spend pretty soon. It's also about expectations for the economy, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done. On job guarantee, coming from that perspective, I think we're far away from that. Because, and I guess this is, comes back to some of the basic issues of the European Union, or of having a monetary union. This was all built on the promise of convergence, right? Because then you can also have some kind of convergence on, for instance, having public sector jobs provision and having a certain wage that you set for it. Like, I think you proposed €7 in your paper. Well, we haven't really seen that much of that convergence. We've rather seen the opposite. So you can't really have a common wage level at the moment. You can probably institute some kind of country-specific policy. But I think you're probably even missing quite a bit of legitimacy with the European Union to do something like that. We have to work on the economic and the kind of political side to get that ready. So I do think that kind of policy will be a long way out. And, if I'm wrong, then probably happy.
Okay. So I just wanted to back up to something Achim said about, okay, let's be pessimistic now. We have to take a stepwise approach. Achim, what's a realistic step in that case?
At the moment, basically the EU has bought some time, because we have the resilience fund, and this will, hopefully, it does support many of the member states, and those that were hit the hardest are supported the most. So that's good, and that will help them to overcome the crisis, and most optimistically to even boost their economies for a while, for 2 or 3 years. So we'll have a recovery everywhere. That's a good thing, and in the meantime, maybe we will have changed the fiscal rules, and then let's see how far we get with a permanent fiscal capacity. There is this discussion, and many institutions that usually have a sound fiscal policy orientation or reputation. Even the European Fiscal Board has already said you either change the rules or you will inevitably bend them forever. So I think that's pretty cool. So that could be the steps. I agree that it's interesting, Warren, to listen to you how you say, okay, we're already there. I think many people would fiercely disagree, and even if they it would be a suspicion that we could be there, and if we were there, then we would have to do anything to get out of the situation, and really do the consolidation and withdraw support from the ECB. That's how it goes. I mean, there are constitutional courts people will press charges there. It's really a mess. So it's I see intellectually your point, but I don't think that's how it will go in the euro area. So, but maybe there's a stepwise interpretation of what you suggested, and then finally we have some stable architecture that's possible.
Okay, that's great. Well, I was about to turn it over to the audience questions and comments, but does anybody have any final thoughts before we move on to those?
Christian, just to put a bow on that point of Achim, I mean, I think again that's probably the most likely scenario, a continuation of these incremental steps. I mean, the Commission and the European Council have been talking for years. I mean, literally a decade now about completing the European Union. They've obviously very careful around their language with anything that looks like fiscal union, but it's the facts have changed on the ground. Obviously, you go through the whole acronym soup. They have their acronym soup like the US does with the ESM and the ESFS and OMT, and of course OMT, outright monetary transactions, which I think was challenged in the Constitutional Court, as I seem to remember. But not one euro has actually been put behind OMT. Just that, one paragraph in Mario Draghi's speech in July 2012 literally changed the world. Greek yields came down from almost 30% to now there's 70 basis points. So that was an absolute game changer. And then of course you have, with all the QE the ECB has done, now their balance sheet is north of 8 trillion euros. I think if they'd never done very late to the game, 2015 January I think it started. I think my calculation, rough back of the envelope, probably without QE asset purchases, it would have been 2.5, maybe 3 trillion. They're up to 8 and going higher. So an awful lot has happened. But what I worry, and I think will continue to happen, particularly crisis driven, what worries me, or would worry me if I was sort of really sitting in Europe and my future hinged on this, is the politics of the whole situation. That there is this very technocratic kind of flavor to all the architecture changes that have happened in Europe. And when you've still got the likes of the Italys, the Greeces, the Spains, Portugal, with still high unemployment, GDP not having regained even pre-financial crisis levels, this and an increasing sort of disconnect. In other words, the technocrats and the elites don't seem to have been very successful, or maybe even tried to sell the Hamiltonian vision to the people themselves in a way that resonates democratically. So that is, I think, if the wheels fall off this project, it will come through the economic strains and stresses bleeding into the politics, then probably destabilizing the politics. The political framework in Brussels and Frankfurt, and then markets going haywire after that. So dysfunctional monetary unions can survive for a long time, but if they're not properly designed, they can fall apart and unravel very, very quickly. That's not a forecast, but it's a worry.
Thanks for that, Paul. Any other business before I dive into the comments from anyone? Just dive in if you've seen anything you like. Okay, I'll move into this. I saw something interesting. Give me a second. Sorry about this. Okay, so this is from Jan Prokot, and they write, "Chartalism thought of from the other side. The state gives a reason for accepting money, but then money is a symbol of the authority of the state. It can therefore also become a symbol of a nation and support the creation of a nation, as the high identification of Germans with the mark proves. Couldn't the euro then also have helped to unify the European? Oh, sorry, it keeps jumping. Couldn't the euro then also have helped to unify the European Union by being a symbol?" Who wants to have a first stab at commenting on that? I'm just going to pick one of you if nobody.
I'll jump in. So I'll jump in, Christian. I'll jump in. I mean, I think there's a lot to that. Yes. And again, something that is on the side of the euro is that it is now 20 odd years old, and the European, if you listen to the Commission or ECB folks, they when we have these pessimistic kind of discussions, they always trot out questionnaire public polls which show that there's very high support among the public for the euro. As a currency. So I think there's a lot in that. What I think is less well understood, is what it means for everybody to join together and have that euro currency. It's not just the convenience of being able to travel, around those 19 countries and not have to worry about exchange rates and different currencies. But it is a real pooling of sovereignty. And this is the thing that has always struck me with talking to European interlocutors and colleagues. And I don't think anyone on this panel is in this category, but people who'll say, no, the euro is great, but we can't go to fiscal union because that would be really, that would be like political union, and we haven't signed up for that. And my response is always to say, the moment you signed up for monetary union and you gave up that most important, from an MMT perspective as well, ability to create your own money and fund your government, you have already crossed that Rubicon. So it should be, in theory, much easier to complete the process. But I don't think it's necessarily being kind of explained that way.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, can I just quickly add to this? Because
please.
That was very interesting, I think, working in the government. I mean, I came from outside and, I'd never really worked in Germany before joining the Ministry of Finance in 2018. And I was really wondering, what people were thinking about this whole fiscal monetary union thing and sovereignty. And, basically very often the red line is, we can't give away national sovereignty. Well, the problem is once you have a common currency, I mean, that ship has sailed a little bit. And if it hasn't, you really have a problem in so many ways. So, I mean, I wasn't there when, discussions around the euro started, or the euro was introduced. I mean, I got it as a kid and I was excited about new coins. Achim can maybe say more about that, but I don't know. I think an explanation at that point was really missing about what we were doing there. Or, maybe you have to jump and then you have to do it afterwards, and then you have to explain, well, we're all really like one boat and now we have to do something about this so it works. That did not happen, and we're definitely not there. So then you're kind of tied at the hip, but you don't understand. And I think that's a real problem today.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any thoughts, Achim?
No, I just
sorry.
I agree with everything I heard.
Yeah. Okay,
I remember the new coins, and actually, when we just had the new coins, we went to France, and that was really a wonderful moment. Really, sharing our coins with French people. So people who didn't know each other before, who were just talking to each other. Look, that's on your money, isn't it great? So that was really something, really a historical moment. But as Paul and Philippa have said, it wasn't explained, and instead, or to the contrary, there was a controversy before. and that's basically the controversy that we're still having. The fear that the new currency would be inflationary because the periphery countries would somehow run irresponsible fiscal policy, which would then cause inflationary pressure and all that. So that was exactly the debate. There were hundreds of professors signing articles and pushing changes in the architecture. So it was really contested right from the start, and that's what's coming up all the time. So that's really the problem. So that there would have been the chance. I mean, now is the first time that we're really seeing some inflation actually, which is of course not due to intrinsic factors, but in terms of inflation, the euro was an extremely stable, even too stable currency. I think so. Many of the worries were just not right. Yeah, but that's how it goes.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a question from Stuart Medina now. That's probably. Did anybody else want to come in there for a second?
Yeah, I think quickly. So, if you look at the U.S. states, for example, they are not global actors. New York's worried about what's happening with the roads in New York and the schools and that type of thing, and all the U.S. states don't have opinions about whether we should be in Afghanistan or not. That's all Congress. It's all at the federal level. And so what we've seen is that transition in Europe over the last 30 years or 25 years, whatever it's been since they irrevocably locked the currencies. And so, Italy and Spain and Germany used to be global actors, and now they're not. And it took a while for the politicians, the political system to adjust to that. But now the adjustments is a long way there. And so when you look at the elections, they're now like local elections within these nations. They've all turned inwards. They've all turned towards governance, within this union of their own territories. And they're no longer global actors at all. They're not involved in it. And those aren't issues in their national campaigns. Now, immigration a little bit, but not to the extent, of course, that it was before, which I think it's a good thing. Now, what you need that for is if there's a common defensive issue, if you're worried about defending against Russia or against China or something like that. And so that's been let slide, and Europe has no capability against all-out war with anybody right now. But let me just throw that out as some major change that that's been undergone, some political shift here, and that I find fascinating to watch and to see when I talk to politicians now versus 30 years ago, European politicians.
Okay, so this question is from Stuart Medina, kind of gets to the heart of what we've been talking about here. Stuart asks, do you think a real democracy within the EU, with countries so culturally different as, say, Estonia and Portugal, is possible without a common demos, media, political parties, trade unions? Do you think it's possible without those, I guess you'd call institutions? I think this is for the Europeans to answer. So I'll turn to you, Philippa.
No, I mean, we need common institutions, right? This is made a bit more difficult by obviously the language barrier, but also, and I guess this is where also young impatient people like me probably have to remind ourselves, this kind of stuff takes time, right? I mean, you can't just forge a nation state within a couple of years or even a decade. There's a fantastic paper, I thought, by Bruegel, a think tank from Brussels, that basically looks at the US and the monetary and fiscal union in the US and what that took throughout history to evolve. And I mean, basically, and it does so, from a European perspective, and what are the implications for us? And it ends with, well, hopefully we don't need 2 civil wars to get there. That is my hope as well. I think we do really need to get there, because otherwise, we will have a problem preserving the way of life we have. But it's not an easy path, and it's not the conclusion isn't there yet. So I think I do think agency matters, and whether committed politicians are there who can also help to form a union in a way that people can see that vision and are able to just jump a little bit and take on a European identity. It's easily, I think, underestimated how much is still national and how much people still derive from a national identity. I'm not convinced that we've really moved beyond that.
Okay. And Achim, do you have any comment on that?
No, of course I agree. It's but once again, I think the only chance is a stepwise approach. And I mean, if you talk to the people in Brussels, the European Parliament, the Commission, there you have this EU or European identity and community, actually. So and there's a European spirit there. You can really feel it. That's impressive, despite all the language problems and the cultural differences. So it works there. Mm-hmm. And the only way is to move forward in little steps, and when finally then we can arrive at the institutions. And but of course it's we should actually really encourage steps to go there, and not pretend that we can stay where we are. So that's the problem, I think.
Okay.
Christian, can I just make one quick, again, as an outsider, is around this democratic deficit issue. One challenge, let's put it in the box of a challenge here, is this sort of sui generis political architecture they have, where the European Parliament, which has elected parliamentarians from the whole EU, does not initiate legislation, and the power to initiate legislation resides in the Commission, which is a very sort of bureaucratic entity that tends to be staffed by bureaucrats and elites from the nation states, who then make their careers in Brussels. And the president of the European Commission, has sort of executive power as well as sort of administrative power. And I think one, again, I don't know if we want to talk about this at all now, but just to post it out there, a little bit disappointing to me was to see what happened at the last European elections with the European Commission president, where there had been this beginnings of this Spitzenkandidaten system. My German is terrible. But the idea, building on a provision in the Lisbon Treaty, that the election of the president of the European Commission would start to reflect the results of the parliamentary election. And, with Juncker, that happened. It was supposed to happen with the last president. And then there were all these smoke-filled, or I guess in Europe it's not smoke-filled anymore, but backdoor deals, and all these positions were stitched up, and then Ursula von der Leyen popped up all of a sudden. And so the Spitzenkandidaten approach, which was supposed to sort of bring in a little bit of direct democracy into the process, sort of seemed to have died a bit of a stillborn death. So that seems to me to be, in terms of the political and the democratic legitimization, moving forward with these other advances on the more technocratic institutional front, maybe took a step backwards. I don't know if my European colleagues would agree with that or not.
Anybody want to pick up that baton there?
Fully agreed. But I think, it's whether it's a parliament or it's a commission, or it's even about knowing your local representative. We do not have a functioning democracy in Europe that can work as a government, not even close.
Mm-hmm. Achim? Right. Okay. Right. So I will. I'll just do what I think is a bit of summing up, and then I will turn to the four of you for any kind of closing statements. So, if you do have a song or something, get ready to bust it out. But it seems to me what's being said here is we started off probably getting to the conclusion that there's two directions we could go in. The Eurozone can go in. One is the nation states reclaim monetary sovereignty, and then the other one is to the drive towards fiscal union, because that's the problem or the challenge, as Paul would rephrase it. But there's probably also a third way, which is we bumble along. And crises drive the kind open little windows for the kind of step changes that Achim was talking about. So that's my take on what's come out of this conversation. But I'll turn to each of you in turn and see if you have anything to add to what I've just said. I'm sorry if I oversimplified there, but you guys can keep me honest. So maybe Warren, you could start.
Oh. I just want to say, over the last 30 years, this is the most constructive panel, or whatever, I'm not sure how to call it, that I've been on, or, heard these kinds of discussions the whole time. And it's gotten, and it's something that never would have existed 20 years ago. So I think that hopefully it's reflective of what's going on with other discussions in Europe now. And if they're anywhere near this type of discussion, I'm certainly, here I am, the optimist here, but I'm reasonably optimistic here. Not that anything's going to happen today or tomorrow, but that, kicking and screaming maybe a little bit, but it's in the process, and the process is a slow one, sometimes a painful one, but it seems to be moving towards, where I see it has to move, and where it's ultimately going to be.
Okay, so we've heard from the definite optimist, and we'll move to it's too strong to call you the pessimist, Achim, but maybe perhaps just the other end of the spectrum, towards the other end of the spectrum. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm not sure I'm so pessimistic. It's just that I'm maybe stepping on the brake a little and.
Yes.
Talk about the stepwise approach, but that doesn't mean one has to be pessimistic. I mean, as I said before, I would never have imagined that we'd get something like this fund, this rescue fund on the European level. So that's well, maybe one thing that I don't know whether it's optimistic, but if you talk about splitting up of the euro area. So I mean, there was this interesting book by Joseph Stiglitz where he was really and I think rightfully attacking many governments, mostly the German government, for what it did in the euro crisis. And then he said, I mean, if you have to agree on some principles how to run the system. And many of the principles were similar to the principle that we discussed today. But if the people are not ready for it, if they just don't want it, if they do the opposite, then maybe it's better to have a friendly divorce. That was his idea. But then, if you really look at it, then he didn't really come up with a very good explanation on how you would actually do this. And in the end, the result was pretty similar, because to have this, without a big crisis, you would need some goodwill. You need the friendly aspect. You would have governments to agree on many things. And then my conclusion would be, if you want the divorce, but having the divorce actually support exactly what you need to keep the system running, then why don't you let the system run? Why don't you support the system and just be friendly without the divorce? Okay, so that's maybe the one important thing that I would like to say.
Okay, that's good, and yeah, that's quite the paradox that you put out there. I'll turn to Philippa next. I guess what it is, what's going to help people on the ground is knowing what to want policy-wise. What do you have anything to say about that, Philippa?
Sure, and I mean, let me try and be a bit more optimistic in the end, at least. So one thing that has been very, very surprising to me in a positive way is, how much has already changed. When I kind of started to, kind of really listen to the German debate again, that was between like 2016 and 17. It was still all about, the balancing the budget and, basically getting the highest possible surplus, and that was the best thing that could happen. The debate here has moved on a lot, has changed completely. We're now just before a national election. There's only one party still campaigning on a balanced budget. So things have changed a lot. The fact that an organization like Dezernat Zukunft can actually exist and, gets invited to things is pretty exciting. And, you have to give credit to everybody. Like, people have been pretty open-minded. So I think a lot has changed, a lot can change. What I want to say also to everybody listening, I think we can really all do a lot. What is necessary is it is mentally really, really hard and makes it a lot more harder than going with, the nice clean theory. But we need to start with the status quo. You need to take into consideration like the political aspect, the legitimacy aspect. Sometimes we can't jump, and sometimes the steps are smaller and uglier. You need to spend a lot of time reading legislation. I'm not a lawyer. I've gotten used to that and reading commentary on legislation. But it's really rewarding. It really pays off because the people, on the European level, as well as the national governments, they're also looking for solutions. They're not all evil. They actually want to get somewhere constructive. Just have quite a lot of constraints. So I think it really pays off to engage and to engage deeply and to put forward ideas. So, anybody who's keen on Europe working out, come on board, help. Lots of ways to do that from, all your different perspectives and points of expertise.
Thank you. And I'll just say before I forget to say it that if you go to the website of the International MMT, European International MMT Conference, which will probably be in the show notes, you will see the schedule for tomorrow, which is September the 15th, and there are a lot of presentations, too numerous for me to list here in the time we have left, but also these are all Zoom conferences, so there are links on the site for you to go to for you to attend these presentations. So that's tomorrow. But also, as Philippa was saying there, that if you want to get involved, there are these organizations now, and I'm sure if you Philippa's organization is going to be listed on the website if you want to get in touch, just for instance. And obviously the MMT door is always open to anybody that wants to follow our effort. Me and Patricia, we're at MMT Podcast on Twitter. Little plug there. Oh, and Warren.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing here. Look, there's been a core group of MMT activists since probably the last 10 years ago. That was originally started by a journalist, Paulo Bernard. And these people are dedicated, intense. Their scholarship is of the highest quality. They're promoting the knowledge and the understanding, person to person, grassroots movement. It started in Italy. Got people in Austria, Spain, France, and Poland, and and you can't underestimate the contribution they've made towards what is looking to me like, ultimately going to be successful. And so far, and you can see when top European Union officials at the central bank are just mentioned the word MMT. People in government are mentioning it, economists mentioning it. Mm-hmm. It didn't come down from the top. It came up from the bottom, from these grassroots activists working on this cause. And it's an interesting cause that has attracted this kind of, intense effort to get the word out. And my hat's off to them. And I want to thank them right now for all they've done to get us here.
Me too.
And you're one of them, by the way. It came a little later, but it's the same type of thing. You come out of nowhere, whatever got you started to actively be promoting this understanding. But it's just something grabs you, a certain truth to it, and recognizing that that this is something worth spending your life doing. And again, I'm glad to have been alive to observe this kind of an international movement.
Me too. And so thank you, Warren. And we'll give the last word to Paul, I guess, because we need a closing statement from Paul. So it's over to you. Oh, sorry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's
no pressure.
No, that's
I didn't mention Australia. Big movement out of Australia.
Of course.
Yeah. Mitchell down there. Just enormous efforts.
Indeed. Well, just maybe as a closing note, then let me just kind of, I think what's happened the last 10 years from my vantage point, I cut my teeth on sort of these issues as a Japan economist sitting in Tokyo, trying to work out what the Bank of Japan was doing with what became known as quantitative easing, started in 2001 in March. And then over the years, sort of, ran into various writings, Warren's very early on, and then Randy Ray's and people like that, read a lot of that stuff. Wynne Godley, obviously, very good, wonderful book there a few years back. But I've sort of had a foot in, I've had a foot in the sort of MMT world and sort of discovered that and sort of come out of the mainstream world of economics. And, I wrote an op-ed, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, where I sort of said, look, there are some disagreements. And look, I mean, mainstream economics is argued between Keynesians and monetarists and Austrians and rational expectations and et cetera, et cetera. So disagreements between different sort of groups of economists or schools is hardly new. But if we look at what's going on in the world today and maybe different languages being used, there seems to be an incredible amount of agreement, alignment among so-called MMT economists and mainstream economists. I'm thinking of people like Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, who's often, they've engaged from time to time. Olivier Blanchard, who was the president of the American Economic Association, gave his keynote address a couple of years ago where he said, look, maybe we have to rethink fiscal sustainability. Interest rates seem to be permanently low. And we don't have to worry about sustainability in the way we used to. So it seems to me that there's a lot of sort of potential agreement around particularly economic policy and how we should move the institutional frameworks forward. So I ended my op-ed a couple of years ago by a call for the MMTers and the mainstream to sort of put down their pitchforks and join together a little bit more. So let me just leave on that more optimistic note, because I still do feel like there's a little bit of, there's a lot of distance, and it almost feels a little bit, this raged in the blogosphere a couple of years ago. A lot of the mainstream economists started looking at MMT, digging into it, often being critical of it, but now they seem to have gone back to a large extent to kind of ignoring it again. And I think that's just not healthy for anybody.
No, that is a great note to leave it on. Put down the pitchforks, everyone. So with that, I will say thank you to these wonderful, esteemed panelists. And thank you to the organizers of the conference. And stay tuned for more presentations tomorrow. And yes, with that, thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.